In China, a woman is still largely defined by biology, right? So age, ideally in China, it's believed that sort of the ideal age for giving birth is around 27. And so if a woman is getting married after 27, she's already, in the eyes of many, past her prime childbearing age, and therefore she's less appealing as a wife or as a mother or just as a woman in general. This idea of leftover, comes from that you've passed your prime and you're not as desirable anymore. I first became interested in leftover women because when I first arrived in China, they were everywhere. I was living in Beijing and I was working at a television station with lots and lots of young women. They were all kind of in their early 20s. And my first break after Chinese New Year, so I went on holiday for Chinese New Year and I came back to the studio and I noticed that there was a different feeling in the office and that the sort of attitude, the outlook of many of my colleagues was different, that they looked a bit sad or somewhat depressed. And as I got to know my colleagues better, I realized that they were under a tremendous amount of pressure to get married. And that it just so happens that this pressure reaches its peak around Chunjie because this is when everybody goes home. These girls, many of them were from smaller cities and outside of Beijing, and they had either been educated or were now working in the capital. So in my eyes, they were success stories. They were, the future of China. And I admired them. And I thought, well, surely there's time for them to get married. They're 23, 24. What's the rush? Their parents should be proud that they're in a bigger city. They're working for an international news network. But it wasn't true. And I noticed that it was something that it affected them. I mean, it affected them to the point where I could visibly tell that they were not well, their self-esteem. And I thought that was wrong. Parents are very involved in the dating process. I've interviewed a lot of young women and a lot of parents who kind of, they vetoed dating until women had graduated from college. And the funny thing was, as soon as they graduated from college, it was like, okay, when are you getting married? And it was like, well, how on earth are they going to get married if they've never dated, right? In China, it's more likely that your parents or a meipo or a relative or someone will introduce potential matches for you, very much in a marriage-minded sense. So there's not really, or there hasn't been for a very long time, something like casual dating, right? It's more you meet someone and it's 당연히, right? You're working towards marriage. So that hasn't existed. Of course, it's starting to emerge, but because it hasn't existed for a long time, it coexists in very funny ways with the traditional sense. So I've interviewed women who, will go out and they'll meet people and they'll have their own dates, but then they'll also have dates that are set up by their mom who created a profile for them on Shijijayuan and met someone who she thought would be a good son-in-law. So she sets up this date and, they also have to go on these very orchestrated matches. They're doing both because they're trying to keep parents happy, but also sort of looking in their own right. So one of my favorite parts about researching this book was getting to interview Chinese moms. At the beginning, I thought most of them were all crazy. Why do you want to give your daughters pressure like this? And then I realized, a lot of this pressure comes from love. It's just the way parents show love in China. You learn a lot about China and Chinese culture and this disconnect that you have between generations, right? A lot of the parents of the women and men that I interviewed grew up during the Cultural Revolution. They had a completely different time. I mean, their options for work, for travel, for everything, completely different from what their children have. And in many ways, that speaks to the tremendous capacity that, the ways that China has grown and evolved over the past 30 years. But it also sort of underscores just how different, kids are from their parents. It's like chickens and ducks. And it's a fascinating lens to sort of understand China's history and culture. There was one story about a girl who was a postdoc, right? So she had completed her PhD and now she was getting her postdoc. And she gave us fascinating insight into how difficult it is for women in China who have higher education to find a partner. Because it's, as she said, I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, I'm a female PhD. I'm another gender completely. And I'm just off the spectrum. Men don't consider me as someone that they might want to date or marry because I'm just too educated for them. So there were a lot of eye-opening things that, and also funny stories that made our audience laugh and just conveyed different issues that sort of surround the topic of leftoverness in China. When we called the play The Leftover Monologues, we chose to interpret leftover in a broad sense. So yes, it was about this pressure to marry, but it was also other issues that men and women face. And it would have been very remiss not to acknowledge that China has a huge population of leftover men, who are mainly the byproduct of the one-child policy, right? Men who were born in more rural areas of the country that didn't have as much access to education or job opportunities, and who as a result are quite poor and quite undesirable on that whole Mengdan Hudui spectrum, right? Because they don't have very much. And that's something that, China from a demographic perspective, from a social perspective, needs to think about very seriously. And so, we thought it important to include them. And if you're going to have a play about leftover women, men should be listening. This is definitely a topic that has picked up momentum. More and more people care about it. You see more of it in Chinese media, you see it in Western media. It's something that, is becoming more of a household thing. You have very popular dating shows in China that look at this. There does seem to have been progress, and I think women are living with it with a bit more confidence. It's not the entirely negative word that it was. There's this sort of understanding that it's also not a badge of honor, but it's a sign that, you're discerning, you've accomplished something, you have certain standards, and you're looking for a certain type of life, and until you sort of find a person that, works well within that context, or that you are looking forward to being with, you're not going to make too many compromises. You will make some, of course, because that's necessary, but I think, overall, women are living with it. I hope they're living with a bit more confidence and that there's more awareness.